Hey, what's going on, YouTube? AuraStorm here. I'd like to thank Paul of Team APS for allowing me to guest host today. I'll be bringing a Battlin Boxer deck profile for you guys. Um, if you didn't already know, this is my one of my favorite decks. I'll also be going into the side deck, so this will be a little bit of a longer video. Um, Bit of a history. I've been playing this deck pretty much since Dragon Ruler format. It's gone through like 50 different iterations at this point, but anyway, all that out of the way, let's get to the deck profile. So, of course, 3 copies of Battlin Boxer Glassjaw. This is the primary reason you play the deck. It cycles back your Battlin Boxer monsters from the graveyard when it's sent to the graveyard by a card effect. Also, when it's detached from a XYZ with a continuous effect, such as Battlin Boxer Lead Yoke or 101. It's a really good card. It loops back your monsters sort of like a wind end construct due to Shadow Fusion. And of course, you've got the obligatory 3 copies of Switch Hitter. This is your Wolf Bark. When it's normal summon, it special summons one Battlin Boxer monster from your graveyard. Typically, it's going to be your Glassjaw, and you're going to seed summon into a Lead Yoke or a Nova Kaiser. I don't really think those are pretty much 6 I would play in any build. They're pretty standard. 2 copies of Battlin Boxer Headgeared. I'm not playing Counterpunch in this variant, so I like 2 Headgeared. You don't want to see Headgeared too much. It's more of a card you either want to open with most of the time. You don't always want to see this card, but it's great to open with because you can get your graveyard set up. But if you're not running Counterpunch, you definitely don't want to run this at more than 2. Then 2 copies of Battlin Boxer Shadow. This is one of the new cards that came out in World Superstars. Basically, you can special summon this card from your hand by detaching an Exceed material from one Battlin Boxer monster you control, or Exceed monster. So basically, like you special summon. The cool thing about this card is it allows you to make Nova Kaiser main phase 2. So it's really decent because you can detach and you can special summon this from hand. It's really nice. And that also goes well with Spar because I've never been the biggest fan of Spar personally because like it just seems dead a lot of the times. I don't want to skip my battle phase. But in this build, like I like it because I can make Lead Yoke and Nova Kaiser in one turn with these 2 cards and Switch Hitter, so it's pretty dang nice. And for some of the outside archetype monsters, 2 copies of Photon Thrasher. Photon Thrasher is basically like a beefy beast stick you can special summon, and it's got 0 defense, which is a pretty key stat. And then, of course, 3 copies of Mask Chameleon. A lot of players don't run 3, but I like 3 because I want to see it as often as possible. It's a really good card because it opens up pretty much your entire extra deck to rank 4 and Synchro plays. And I just want to see it as often as possible, so that's why I run it at 3. That's all the monster lineup for the spells. 3 copies Reinforcement Army. I don't really think this doesn't really need an explanation. You've got a mostly warrior deck, so 3 Rhoda. Then 3 copies of Mystical Space Typhoon. Again, you can always bump this down or side these out if you're in a matchup where it's not applicable, but I always would rather have the MST than not. That's one of the reasons there's 3 in there. 2 copies of Forbidden Lance. Forbidden Lance is probably my favorite spell card. It's just, in a deck like this, it's really important to make sure your plays go through. It's sort of like this deck, a lot like other decks such as Black Wings or Fire Fist. Your normal summon is very important. You want to make sure those plays go through. And especially now that Storming Mirror Force is a card, you want to make sure you have something so that card doesn't resolve. And then 2 copies of Dark Hole. I like Dark Hole because it can trigger my Lead Yoke and buff it up to 3k. It won't trigger Nova Kaiser, of course, because it has to be triggered by an opponent's card effect. But I like being able to buff up my Lead Yoke and nuke my opponent's board is nice. You can always run Regeki instead if you feel it's better. Then lastly, 1 copy of Soul Charge. This is mainly because I run a Thought Ruler Archfiend, which allows me to gain life points, and I feel like makes Soul Charge's payment not as costly, so that's why Soul Charge is in here. It's all the spells for the traps. 2 copies of Jolt Counter. I'm iffy. I like this card because a lot of times I like this card because Storming Mirror Force exists. It stops. Now, granted, most of the time, with the exception of Storming Mirror Force, you don't really care about a lot of back row like Mirror Force and stuff like that. You don't necessarily care. Nevertheless, you could always run any kind of battle trap since this built instead of this if you don't like it because this build doesn't really run battle traps. 2 copies of Skilled Prisoner. This is one of my favorite cards in the deck. I often like to run cards that counter the deck's greatest weakness, and this deck's weakness is monster effects that target cards like Castel, 101, and God forbid someone big eyes your Lead Yoke. This is basically like It's like having 4 copies of protection for those Kestels. There's 101s. I really like this card in this deck. It's sort of like with Evil Swarms. You want to keep your monsters from getting, Kestel, 101, etc. Because it's one of the deck's greatest weaknesses is, well, other rank 4s. 2 copies of Call the Haunted. I like this card because when you control a Synchro monster, you can't a normal summon a Chameleon, but you can bring him out of the graveyard with Call the Haunted. Allows me, if my play gets stopped, I can bring a monster back and just keep going anyway. Then 2 copies of Fiendish Chain. I'd consider bumping this to 3, but in this build, I'm running 2. I want to stop my opponent from attacking as well as negate their effects, so I like Fiendish Chain. Now for the 1-ofs, 1 copy of Bottomless Trap Hole. I'm pretty much going to run this in every deck as long as Pendulums exist, just bottomlessing and then get them all off the field. Same thing with Solemn Warning. Like I said with Soul Charge, there's 2 reasons I run Solemn Warning. 1, Soul Charge kind of negs the cost a bit. The second reason is that Denko exists, and I run a fair bit of back row, that's a lot of back row. So, Solemn Warning's a must in a deck where, you don't want to get Denko'd. The 1 copy of Torrential Tribute, one of my favorite things to do with Torrential Tribute is if I have this card set for a turn, I'll drop Lead Yoke and then chain Torrential. I'll wipe my opponent's board, and then they've got a 3k beater just staring at them in the face, so I really like that. And then 1 copy of Emptiness. As long as Emptiness is still legal, at 1 copy, I feel like it's going to be a staple in just about every deck I play. Now we're going to go to the side deck first before we go to the extra deck. 1 copy of Colossal Fighter. The reason I side deck Colossal Fighter is because a lot of times I run Thought Ruler, Archfiend, and Crimson Blader, and those cards don't get their effects when they run over Pendulum monsters. So I side this in, especially against Cliffworts. They have a lot of trouble dealing with this, particularly if you have it backed up by a Skill Prisoner. They can't bounce it with Helix. They can stealth it, but if you're smart and you chain Skill Prisoner before their stealth hits the board, they still can't bounce this. Cleese have even with their Floodgates out, Cleese have a surprising amount of trouble dealing with this card, at least in my experience. So that's one of the reasons it's in here. And then 2 copies of Effect Veiler. We don't want Trishula resolving. I was mainboarding these, but I feel like these are kind of more relegated to the side deck at this point. Especially for certain matchups. We don't want to get Trish, and some effects we just don't want them resolving. 2 copies of Flying Sea, because I think Burning Abyss and Teller Knights are by far this deck's worst matchup, particularly Teller Knights because of Trevor. So we gotta have those Flying Seas for those matchups. Shaddoll, of the meta decks, I'd say Shaddolls is probably your most favorable matchup, simply because Yoke can just punch right over a Construct, so that's not as much of an issue when you do allow them to go into their deck. It's not as much of an issue. And then 2 copies of Spell Shattering Arrow, because I do side a fair amount of Floodgates. As you'll see in the main board, there's no Floodgates, except I feel like most of the time with decks, Floodgates belong on the sides. The Spell Shatterings, for Cleese and other Pendulum decks. And then 2 copies of Shadow Imprisoning and 2 copies of Light Imprisoning Mirror, for Shaddolls, Burning Abyss, etc. For Teller Knights are your worst matchups. You have to have these, for Teller Knights. Then the obligatory 3 copies of Mistake. Mistake is probably one of the best Floodgates of the current format right now. I really like Mistake, and I'm going to probably be side decking these foreseeable future. And then lastly, 1 copy of Soul Drain. I'm probably going to change this to a Skill Drain in the future, because I feel like this deck can actually function pretty effectively under Skill Drain, because you've got Photon Thrasher, can attack under Skill Drain. Glassjaw won't die when it's attacked under Skill Drain. Especially if you get Skill Drain out against, say, Satella Knights, you can just beat over them with your big monsters. So I feel like I'm going to cut Soul Drain in future builds, particularly with Nova Kaiser. Now we're getting into the extra deck. And 2 copies of Battlin Boxer Lead Yoke. Now that you have Nova Kaiser now, you really do not need 3 copies of this. I mean, even before Nova Kaiser came out, I'd rarely go into all 3. So I feel like 2 is kind of the ideal number. And same thing with Nova Kaiser. Now that this card exists, basically you can attach an Exceed material to it, and once it dies by battle an opponent's card effect, it special summons as many materials as it had. So there's some gimmicky things you can do if you decide to run Wrong to Miniad, the number 86, that you can get a bunch of materials on this. Then when it dies, you can bring Wrong to Miniad out with 4 materials, and it's just dumb. But I thought it would be a little gimmicky. But one of the things I like about having Nova Kaiser now is you can make Yoke and Nova Kaiser, so they can try to get rid of one, but they're not going to easily get rid of both. So that's one of the reasons I really like Nova Kaiser. Now we're getting to the end of some of the staples. One Abyss Dweller. Dweller is pretty much a staple because we don't want graveyard effects resolving. We don't want, if I was running Norden in this deck, Dweller would be in here at 2, probably. 1 copy of Evil Storm Exciton Knight. Exciton is probably, one of the better rank 4s for, you know, obvious reasons. You're behind, you make it. It's there when you need it. It's not the, obviously, like, you don't necessarily need this card, but, you know, I like having it. One copy of Castel. Castel is probably one of the best rank 4s right now. Spot removal for anything, you know. Obviously play Castel. One copy of number 101 Silent Honor Arc. I like to have both Arc and Castel because there's certain monsters I don't want to put back in my opponent's extra deck or back in their deck because they're just going to make them again next turn. So I just Arc them instead. Particularly especially if they're Pendulum monsters, I would rather, you know, Arc them instead of Castelling them because they'll be in the graveyard rather than going back into the deck and just getting searched again. And then one copy of King of the Feral Imps. Obviously to search MS Chameleon. This is one of my favorite rank 4s. I try to find room for it in almost any deck I play, so. And then one copy of Karen Gorgon. Karen Gorgon is probably one of the better rank 4s. I love it in combination with Lead Yoke, sort of like in Masked Heroes with Dark Claw, because it keeps my Yokes from getting Fiendish, Breakthrough Skilled, etc. So Karen's pretty much always going to be in here. And lastly, one copy of Dark Rebellion Exceed Dragon. Basically, this card is meant. It's a beefy monster. You can get it over a lot of big threats. So I like Dark Rebellion in here. I was playing Ragna 0, but I found that Ragna just wasn't really cutting it for me. Now we're playing 4 Synchro monsters. One copy of Stardust Dragon. Even though this deck is fairly resilient to destruction, I still like to have Stardust Dragon just in case. When Dimension of Chaos releases, I'm going to change this to Red Dragon Archfiend Scarite, or whatever the TCG name is going to be. Jack's new Synchro. Basically, what it does is it nukes the board of all monsters that have less than its attacks in it, and burns your opponent for 500 for each. So it's really good in combination with Lead Yoke because you can buff Lead Yoke up to 3k, clear your opponent's field of monsters, and just keep swing for lots of damage. So as much as I do love Stardust, I think it's going to probably get cut when that card comes out. And then one copy of Thought Ruler Archfiend. Like I said, I like this card because I can run over monsters, get life points, and then when I draw that Soul Charge or use that Solemn Warning, I don't mind as much. It's also immune to targeting spells and traps, which is really key against some decks like upcoming Magispectors. Like I made this card one of the replay videos on my channel, and it really slowed him down quite a bit because this is immune to all their targeting back rows. So. And then, for that, one copy of Scrap Dragon, because I like Scrap Dragon, pops back row with Lead Yoke, buffs it up to 3k, you know, sounds good to me. And one copy of Crimson Blader, because Crimson Blader just wins games against Shaddoll's. Like, in my regional matches, I'll get this out against Shaddoll's and just start punching over their monsters. And if you have this and some kind of back row backing it up, they have a lot of trouble getting over Crimson Blader because they can't get their big fusions out. So anyway, guys, I'd like to thank all you guys for watching today. It's really appreciated. So if you liked what you saw from this video, check out my channel. It's AuraStorm. You can check out the channel. There'll probably be a link down below the description box. Anyway, guys, I'd like to thank y'all for watching. It's AuraStorm signing out.